Well, welcome back, everybody. I am here with Mr. Kirk Durston, and it's very good to speak to you today, Kirk.
Yeah, and you too, Ben.
So, for the benefit of our audience, if you could maybe just give a quick introduction to yourself for people who might not have heard of you or your work.
Sure. I grew up in central Canada and went off to actually on a farm, cattle and seed farm. Worked as a farmhand until I decided I needed a holiday, and then went off to university at about age 18. I did a number of degrees, one in a bachelor's in physics, then a mechanical engineering degree, and then later on a master's in philosophy because I was interested in the problem of evil and suffering and the existence of God. And then finally a PhD in biophysics. And at the same time, I worked worked with students, university students, for the last about 38 years now, and mostly in a kind of a Christian context, just helping them grow in the spiritual area of their life. But at the same time, at the university level, there's an awful lot of questions about God, philosophy, and science. And one way and another, I began to get invited to do formal debates, lectures, seminars, and so forth. And so I've done that now for, I guess about 30 years or so, spoken at almost all the universities in Canada and some in Scotland, one in England, and a little bit in Europe, and some in the USA. On topics pertaining to God, philosophy, and science, and the kind of the interaction, the big questions that arise out of that. So it's a way of kind of, I enjoy it. It's kind of like hostile peer review, when you study something and then you appear on a campus. Most of the audience, or a good chunk of them, might not agree with what you say. So they ask good questions. There's always a good Q&A at the end. And currently, I'm married. I have 6 kids. They're all married. Got 10 grandkids, or 9, and one more on the way. So
That's quite good going as far as the lineage you could create. A bit of a kind of a quite prolific in that sense.
yeah. Well, the winters are cold here.
So I'm a little bit confused though, because you say you have a PhD in a scientific field, obviously, and then you have interest in God. Would you describe yourself as a Christian?
Yeah, I would. But no, that word Christian is quite broad, of course. It goes from one extreme to the other. But I would describe myself as I would say a sincere Christian, a person who takes faith seriously. And even in philosophy, I found that master's in philosophy handy as well, because one of the professors told me, when he found out it was actually an atheist professor, he says, "Oh, you're going to lose your faith in philosophy." And I found it was quite the opposite. I just thoroughly enjoyed it. I just love intellectual challenges and working through things.
Well, that's exactly what I was going to ask about, because there's lots of people in today's society who would say that you have religion on one end of a spectrum and then science and reason and philosophy on the other, and that religion is sort of superstition, and that nobody who was interested or adept in science could also hold religious views. This is a common belief I'd find among a lot of people in society today. What would you say to somebody who said that to you?
Well, I think there are issues on both sides. I mean, certainly religious people are not all, intellectual people thinking through things critically and rationally. On the other hand, science has had some severe problems and is engaging in some severe problems as we speak. And that's been highlighted in journals such as Nature about, just the rise in a number of what they call, factors that are not good. People are more motivated by economic prestige and funding and so forth, and that tends to taint science. So I think if we analyze both ends, and I don't even call them both ends because I'm both, and I would say there is the golden aspect of science, which is more experimental science, and then there's more inferential science, where we begin to infer conclusions from data that we actually have, but the conclusions themselves can't be tested. And then finally, we have at the far end fantasy science, and that's been called out by even several articles in Nature and New Scientist, when that includes things like string theory, multiverse theory, and so forth. But in the religious end of things, we have also just a wide variety of even notions of what faith is, from a blind leap in the dark, which I don't think is good at all, to a rationally based faith. And so I would tend to see myself as hopefully rationally based faith. thought through. I would have reasons for thinking and believing as I do, as opposed to just a total blind leap in the dark.
Absolutely. And I'm sure, as you yourself will be well aware, the scientific method as we know it today was developed largely by Christian monks, Christian priests, clergymen for the most part, and that I don't think these things are mutually exclusive or in opposition to one another. They kind of go hand in hand in a lot of ways. That many of the early scientists during the Enlightenment, they would have viewed science as a form of worship, that you're trying to peel back the layers of reality and examine God's creation so you can better understand his nature.
Yeah, absolutely. It is a form of worship. And I think I love the scientific method. But that's where modern science has kind of run into some issues where they're departing from the scientific method. And there's been some controversy in the journals on this, because some scientists are advancing this idea that science does not necessarily have to be testable or verifiable. And when you abandon testability and verifiability, you then start moving into the realm of fantasy and inference and creative storytelling and so forth.
Absolutely, most definitely. Well, you wrote an article which I was very intrigued by, entitled "Why Sexual Morality May Be Far More Important Than You Ever Thought." And this was really fascinating, I thought. But before we get into the content of the article, I just want to ask, from a devil's advocate perspective, why is sexual morality so important? I mean, surely it's just another biological function like eating or sleeping or drinking. We don't need to put great moral weight on what we decide to, how we decide to sleep, what position you want to sleep in, on your front or on your back. So why is sex in particular such an important aspect of human life, do you think?
That is a very good question. And if I were just to answer that without having read his book, and I think what I'll say is consistent with what I'm going to talk about shortly, I would say one of the main factors is that because sex is different from other, say, bodily functions like eating or other activities we engage in that we won't describe in detail here. It's different from that because it involves relationships, and relationships, as soon as it's done with other people, and because sex is such an intimate way of relating with engaging with other people, then it may have consequences that go beyond just simply a bodily function that we do on a daily basis or a weekly basis or whatever. And when relationships are involved, you start getting aspects of society that are affected by those relationships. For example, how the children will be raised, what kind of environment the children will be raised in, and what those children will turn out to be like when they become adults and begin parenting their own children. And it'll reflect on things like the work ethic when we talk about relationships in the context. So sex seems to be a fundamental aspect of something we call marriage, which has gone throughout many different societies and cultures. They may call it different things, but there's this relationship between men and women that we describe as marriage that provides a context within which to raise our children. And the sexual relationship within marriage seems to be a powerful, or can be a powerful, bond. Now, when that is not regarded, that bond is no longer unique, and something breaks down, and there's people like Mary Eberstadt that have gone into this in great detail, what the consequences are. So I would say, if you wanted to sum it up in one sentence, I would say because relationships are involved, and sex has a profound impact on human relationships.
Well, that's a very good answer, and I hadn't thought of it from that perspective, but surely there's people at home who'll say, well, yes, at one point in our society's history, sex may have been intrinsically linked to marriage, but today it isn't. And there's many people who would say that was an archaic way of doing things, and now we have the sexual revolution, and isn't it so wonderful that anyone can sleep with anybody else at any time, and isn't it great? So why do you think sex is intrinsically linked to the marital union, and why should it be?
Well, okay. I think at some point, I mean, totally understand our culture saying things like that. I mean, I was a teenager once. And when I was a teenager, that was back in the late 60s, early 70s, and the sexual revolution was just beginning. And it did sound rather tantalizing and interesting because you could be happy not just with your wife, but you could be happy with a lot of people. And it seemed at that time that it would actually allow it would increase the happiness level in our society if we sort of abandoned the traditional constraints of just keeping sex in a relationship such as marriage. But at some point, I think we need to test our theories out with real data. You know, we got to look and say, what are the long-term effects? And humanity has a tendency to look at the short term, especially our culture today. We'll look at the immediate consequences, and if they appear good to us, well, then let's go for it. But we're very poor at looking at long-term consequences. And this is where people like J.D. Unwin, who've studied the long-term consequences in societies and civilizations, have discovered that, oh, wait a sec here. There does actually seem to be a correlation here between sex within what a culture we call marriage and sex outside of it. And that consequence, or those consequences, can be devastating on the long term, or even the medium term, but devastating for societies and civilization. In fact, it's not can be, it's will be devastating. And then, of course, the question is, well, why? So I totally understand the culture's attitude. I mean, I'm a human being myself, but on the other hand, there is the possibility that morality is not just something cooked up by, like, say, Judeo-Christian morality. I've often heard people say, oh, well, that was just invented by a bunch of nomadic goat herders like thousands of years ago. Why would you possibly apply that to today's culture? But maybe it wasn't, you see. Maybe, and we see that traditional morality is not just unique to Judeo-Christianity. It has arisen in other cultures as well. So maybe there's something more. Maybe morality is there. We'll call objective morality, because I certainly understand how different cultures might try and modify that. But objective morality might exist in order to minimize human suffering and maximize human flourishing.
Absolutely. No, I think you're absolutely right. And one of the data points you could point to on this is the fact that my generation, Generation Z, which has grown up with this sexually liberated society our entire lives, we're the most depressed generation in living memory, to my knowledge. And it's not like it's related to poverty. I mean, society is richer than it's ever been. Of course, there's still poor people, but we're a lot better off than, say, our parents were or grandparents were. And yet, so many young people today feel, and I'm not putting that entirely down to this one issue. Of course, it's going to be a variety of factors. Like with anything, nothing is that straightforward or simple. But it just goes to show that the more liberal and free, quote unquote free, so-called free society becomes on issues like this, the less happy people are. Provably, that's what the data says. That's how people feel, and we don't need to speculate about that. Or, maybe in the 1950s or 60s, when it was this kind of kooky new idea on paper that we're just thinking about, maybe then you could postulate. But now we know the information is in, and it doesn't look good for this little social experiment we've been trying for the last few decades.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head when it comes to a very important link between a sexual revolution and sexual freedom and where society goes when you mentioned mental health. And you are right. I mean, all the data is showing that we have a phenomenal rise in people who are facing serious mental health challenges. And Mary Eberstadt, in her book Primal Scream, looks at that question: why do we have such an explosion in mental health challenges in today's society, and especially amongst the younger people? Why is that? And so she begins to work backwards, and her book is extremely well referenced. One of the most well referenced books I've ever seen in my life. About a quarter of the book, I'm speaking roughly here, is just references at the end of the book. But she traces it back to the sexual revolution. And so what is it about the sexual revolution that has resulted in things like mental health, mass shootings, identity politics, and so forth? and distills it down to, with the sexual revolution, the family began to be decimated. And with the decimation of the family, something happened. Specifically, she argues that we all have some sort of an identity that we get from our siblings and our extended family, like cousins and aunts and uncles. We have a sense of identity from that. And the sexual revolution destroyed that family and extended family. So at least as far as number of siblings and getting together with the cousins and so forth. When that is destroyed, a huge fundamental need within a human being disappears. That is this sense of identity. And when that goes, there is a massive increase in mental health challenges. The mental health of an individual deteriorates substantially. And then a lot of these other symptoms take place. And I think when I read J.D. Unwin's work on sex and culture and then read Mary Eberstadt's analysis, I think Mary Eberstadt has shown why what we do with our sexuality is so vital to the survival and flourishing of our culture, and specifically to the mental well-being of the individuals within that culture.
No, I think you're totally right about that, and this is something that people, I think, don't think all the way through when you think about the consequences, the domino effect that something like loosening sexual morality has on so many other issues, be it divorce, abortion, even now demographics that we're seeing. As you know, we're facing this demographic time bomb in so many parts of the West. I believe the Pope was recently warning about this, how there aren't enough children being born because of plummeting birth rates to maintain our society going into the future. I think the Lancet, they recently published a paper that said that by the year 2100, the world population is set to go down as an overall number for the first time in centuries, since like the Black Death or one of these catastrophic, but it's the first time ever that this has happened purely due to decreasing birth rates. So I guess all I'm trying to say is that these things have much deeper implications than people realize when they go, well, it's me, it's my own sexual habits, what has it got to do with you? Well, it has a lot to do with all of us. This is a society-wide issue that we're not taking seriously enough, at least in my view. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, no, I would agree, Ben, that that all of these, we have we're very poor at foresight. Humanity is. We're very good at hindsight. Actually, I would question even that, because hindsight is gained from a real serious study of history and learning from history. And I would have to say that at least here in Canada, in our educational system, there is practically nothing being learned from history anymore. We're not learning lessons, or history is being reinterpreted to fit and support our current, whatever our culture wants, which is also a very bad thing. It's being rewritten. But the bottom line is that I keep thinking of a verse in the Bible that says, flee youthful lusts, which wage war against the soul. So in the immediate, sexuality with anybody might seem pleasurable, but in the long term, the very soul of humanity is being destroyed by this inordinate use or illegitimate use of our sexuality. It is very good within the proper context. Outside of that context, as the work of J.D. Unwin showed, it will actually destroy civilization every time, no exceptions, within 100 years of the sexual revolution.
Well, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I think you touched on a really important point there, that obviously nobody is saying that sex isn't good or that sex is bad. Like, I think whenever you have this conversation, people try to treat you like you're some kind of old-timey Victorian, prude or something like this. I mean, you can say that overeating or overindulging in food is bad for your health. That doesn't mean you're anti-food. We're talking about what is the correct usage of this thing that everyone understands implicitly is good. In fact, I think more babies in society would actually be a great thing, as long as it's managed and controlled correctly, which is the whole point of what we're discussing. That I think in a weird way, the advocates for the sexual revolution, they're far more anti-human than those who are opposed to it. That the narrative, or I suppose the mantra of the whole movement is, well, people should just do what's natural to them. And what I say is, well, yeah, we should do what's natural to us, but what is our nature? We're human beings. We're not dogs. We're not animals, you know. We shouldn't just run around having sex with everything that moves. We developed these systems as a society for a reason over thousands and thousands of years because they work, and we should try to uphold that and maintain it to the best of our ability.
Yeah, in fact, as you spoke there, it reminded me of a kind of like an idea that I've had, or just basically a way of describing our culture today. What the sexual revolution has been fighting for is the freedom to behave like animals, where there are no constraints. And I would have to say that the sexual revolution is leading to the dehumanization of humanity, or another way of put it, it's leading to the animalization of humanity. Now, that's, for some people, they actually think that's a good thing. In fact, they want to elevate animals up to our level or bring us down to the level of the animals. They wouldn't use the word up or down. They want to recognize humanity as just another animal. But there is a serious problem with that when you look at the consequences of humans behaving like animals. And I think maybe the fundamental problem is what I might call human nature. That human nature isn't 100% beautiful and good. There are a lot of ugly aspects of human nature that, if we behaved like animals, would, like, I was raised on a beef farm. And what people may not know is when you put a new cow into a herd, you think cows are peace-loving and very sedate, and so not so. When you put a strange cow into the herd, there is immediately a series of battles that go on to reestablish the pecking order within that herd of cattle. And that's the way humanity would go. It'd become very ugly, actually, and sexuality is part of that.
No, I think you're absolutely right about that. That I mean, so many of these systems that seem archaic. I believe, was it Chesterton who said, before you take down a fence, you should first ask why it was put up. I think that was Chesterton. That a lot of these old systems that we think of as, sure, what relevance has that got today? We don't stop and think about why that was put in place. I mean, I remember I was in Colombia several years ago, and I was learning about the local tribes, and I've forgotten the specifics. I couldn't name the individual tribes, but the tour guide who was showing us around, who was a local, was telling us that one of the tribes in particular was far more successful than all of its neighbors. It was like the local superpower. And historians now attribute that to the fact that they had a very strict prohibition in their culture on two things: adultery and incest. You weren't able to marry your cousin or anything like that. And if you slept with, I think they had polygamy, but if you slept with anyone outside of your polygamous marriage, there were very serious consequences. Whereas all their neighboring tribes didn't have those same restrictions. You could marry whoever you want, sleep with whoever you want, it didn't matter. And as a result, they had a much stronger society. They avoided a lot of genetic problems because of the incest thing, and so on and so forth. And I guess what you realize is that these systems, the reason our society is successful is because of painstakingly developed social contracts and agreements that were put in place for a reason. It wasn't on a whim, as you said earlier. It wasn't like somebody just woke up one day and said, do you know what, we're going to ban X, Y, and Z because we feel like it. No, there's a huge story behind this that we might not necessarily remember, but we should be very cautious before we just start pulling at these things like a Jenga tower.
Yes, that example you mentioned of the tribe that began to have tighter constraints on their practice of sexuality, leading to increased flourishing of that tribe. That actually happens, according to research of J.D. Unwin, who researched 86 different societies, both uncivilized and civilized, which he defined what he meant by those terms. That happened every time, no exceptions. Now, that is truly remarkable. When you discover a principle out there that works every time, no exceptions, then you have found something fundamentally important to humanity. And what he discovered is that there's a tipping point within, he classified the sexuality and how it's applied in different civilizations in a number of different levels. But what he found is that there's a tipping point, and if you cross that tipping point, if you go above that tipping point, every society will flourish. And if you keep it up there, you'll really begin to see the results within 3 generations. But if you drop below the tipping point, in every case, no exceptions, that civilization, society collapses. And unfortunately, that's where our culture is today. We crossed that tipping point a couple of decades ago.
Why do you think people are so sensitive about this issue? Because I'm sure you've experienced this, or at least heard about it, that there's certain topics, like let's say pornography, for example. If you even so much as broach the subject of pornography in a negative context and say, hey, you know what, maybe this isn't good for society, maybe this is not good for people's mental health and they should try to abstain from it, there's a cohort of people, not everyone, who gets extremely offensive and angry at even the mention of such an idea. You don't have to be mean, you could be totally reasonable, but people kind of fly off the handle. And I find that for a lot of these types of issues that it really touches a nerve with some people. Why do you think that is?
I mean, I don't claim to be the fount of all knowledge. And so I am just giving you my own perspective here, which may or may not be, true. But first of all, I think there is a tendency within us as human beings to want to throw off all constraints. We don't want anything to control us or anybody to tell us. Now, in some sense, that there's good aspects to that because it provides checks and balances against, let's say, the rise of authoritarianism within government. But in another sense, throwing off all constraints can be devastating. But let's say pornography, for example, there is a substantial percentage of our population that is actually addicted to it. And from a scientific perspective, when you begin to watch and use pornography, there is an endorphin rush. You get a rush out of that, and the body says, whoa, like there's something going, this is over the top here, we need to moderate that. And the body releases another protein which binds the endorphin receptors to bring down the level of enjoyment of that to more sustainable levels. But when it does that, it reduces the level of all other pleasures. But since that spike is the highest pleasure, one loses pleasure in almost everything else. And so pornography becomes an addiction. And when you start to challenge something that people are addicted to, or that a part of the population is addicted to, well, that is a serious threat to the person. They're going to react in some very significant ways. So that's just part of the problem. I don't, but there's more to it than that. And I haven't put my finger on the whole story. It's mystifying because it should be so patently obvious that porn is not good for a person. There's plenty, both secular and religious. I prefer a lot of times just refer to secular research, because if you look at the religious aspect of things, people just write you off right there. But if you look at the secular research, it is pretty much unanimous that when you actually look at it from a biological perspective, that pornography actually debilitates a person's ability to even, especially men, to be able to have sex with women. And so they need more weirder or off the beaten track type of porn, and it just degenerates from that point on.
I mean, there's so many pieces of evidence now to suggest that there are young boys, teenage boys as young as 18 and 19, who are developing erectile dysfunction because they're so entrenched in this thing. And of course, that's not it's not the majority of people. It might not even be, a lot of people. But the fact that that's happening in society, and I don't ever hear it being talked about, we hear about all kinds of things, how smoking is bad for your health and excessive alcohol. In fact, our health service here in Ireland was just talking about banning smoking altogether because it's such a terrible public health crisis. When have we ever heard about pornography as a public health crisis? Because it is, frankly, when you look at the impact that it has on so many, particularly young men, but young women now as well, unfortunately. And nobody has ever warned about the potential dangers of that. Yeah,
several years ago, I did a little bit of investigation into this. There are secular websites now for men, young men and teenagers who want to just try and get rid of the grip that porn has on them. But erectile dysfunction is a very common consequence of this protein that binds on the endorphin receptors to reduce the pleasure. So to put it simply, the traditional way of being aroused no longer works, simply because they're used to getting a wider variety of stimulation through the eyes watching porn in a wider variety of activities. And as that increases, that's why they need more variety in the porn and more variety in the type of people that are watching on porn videos. So erectile dysfunction is a very real component. And I think one of the websites is nofap.com. I think it's nofap.com. Now, that was a few years back. Whether it's still up and running, I don't know. But that's a secular website where a lot of guys are saying, this is not doing it for me. Or what they will need is, before they can have an erection, they would need to watch a porn video with the woman they're with in order to get sufficiently excited to be able to actually do it with their girlfriend. So it's very debilitating. There's no question about that. And not only that I read an article, and it was done in the UK, on the effect of porn on 11 to 14-year-olds. And what the writer noticed is that the girls are increasingly fearful of having sexual relations with guys simply because of what those guys want them to do that they've seen on porn sites. And so what this is actually doing is creating, making a lot of young women are repulsed by the idea of having sex with men as a result of what the men are asking the women to do. And this itself goes in another direction as well.
So would you say it's fair to say then that it's kind of devastated the relationships between men and women, particularly young men and women growing up in, say, my generation and younger?
I would say so. It does, and for a number of reasons, but it not only devastates relationships, what the longer term results are of the sexual revolution is it destroys the enjoyment of sex itself, at least the normal traditional ideas of sexual relations. And instead, it drives a person to further fringes of things that are off the beaten track, let's say.
Absolutely. You mentioned that there are secular websites that talk about this quite a bit. So I think that's very important to emphasize, because a lot of people really try to pigeonhole this whole issue as something that only religious people, if you're a Catholic or some kind of Mormon or an evangelical Christian, then you're going to be worried about this, but that no rational, enlightened, secular person would have an issue with any of this stuff. Whereas I think you're saying, and I would agree, that there are very good, objective, rational reasons to be opposed to all of this stuff, pornography and everything that comes with it, that it's materially bad. It's not an opinion. It's not a subjective view. It's provable with the data that we have available to us.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, the long-term consequences, we have to look at the data. And I know people have their opinions and their views and so forth, and people can say, oh, that's religious or that's secular or whatever. But at the end of the day, if there is a true principle that exists in the world, that this data from society, the sociological data, will begin to expose that general principle. In fact, I met a number of years ago at a think tank in Washington, D.C. I spent the day there meeting with the various department heads in that think tank. And I'll never forget something the head of the sociology department told me. He said, all the data from the social sciences is now showing that even if we had no religion at all and knew nothing about Judeo-Christian morality, the principles of Judeo-Christian morality emerge as out of the data from the social sciences. That is, if a society lives by those principles, they will flourish in every way. If they abandon those principles, that society will eventually disintegrate. And that's just the pure secular data from the social sciences. Data has to be taken on the long term, not the short term. The reason I say that is I just had a colleague send me some papers last week on supporting this idea of polyamory and studies that say, well, you'll be as happy with multiple partners, consensual, as you would be with one. And so I started looking at that, and immediately I could see, well, there's a serious problem here. They're basically taking a snapshot out of a person's life. They're looking at them, say, in their 20s or early 30s. Are you happy with multiple consensual partners? And they would have to say yes. But a proper study needs to follow those people for the remainder of their lives, into the 40s, their 50s, their 60s. They need to see what the consequences are for those individuals and those relationships, which the data shows will almost certainly not survive. So you leave behind you a trail of broken relationships. But the other problem will be, you need to look at the consequences for the children arising out of those relationships, and what will be the consequences for them. And again, the data shows it's devastating on the long term.
Absolutely. I've been saying this for the longest time, not just as regards the sexual morality issue, but a whole variety of issues, that if, God forbid, there was a nuclear war tomorrow and the whole of society was leveled and we were back to Mad Max anarchy and we had to rebuild a society from scratch, the only societies that would survive would be quote-unquote traditionalist societies that did things a certain way. Like if you take an issue like, say, border control, if you decide, you know what, we don't need walls around our encampment, we're just going to let whoever they want wander in freely, you're going to be overrun by bandits pretty quickly. I don't think that society is going to last too long. Same with, we could have diversity quotas. Maybe we should have the women go out hunting and fighting our wars and the men can stay at home picking berries. Well, again, that society is going to fall apart pretty quickly for biological reasons, and so on and so forth. That there's, in the end, whichever societies lasted and survived from such a scenario, they would end up looking something like a Christian society, a traditional society, and the kinds of society that we're trying to run away from, the one that we don't want to be like, is the one that will be successful and survive. And the one we're running towards is a kind of a disastrous hellscape, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, and that's when J.D. Unwin focused on how traditional sexuality, and broke that down into a number of points. But what his research shows is exactly that and the beauty. This is the beauty of his research. The beauty is that he published it in 1934. And at first, people today will say, 1934? That is so yesterday. Like, what has that got to do with today's civilizations? And that is a very good comeback. That is a very good objection. So, but the beauty of J.D. Unwin's research is that it wasn't just his opinion in 1934. It was pulling out the data of thousands of years of different societies and civilizations and looking for recurring patterns. And then out of that, arose some predictions. And this is where I say it gets beautiful, because as a scientist, it's one thing to listen to a theory. It's quite another if that theory advances testable predictions. And so J.D. Unwin's research advanced testable predictions. And what he found is that the tipping point in a society is when premarital sex is allowed. It becomes, there's no constraints against people engaging in what he called prenuptial sex, because the term marriage and so forth wasn't used in all societies, but they all had this concept of what we call marriage. And there was a before part to it, and then there's the married part of it. So the tipping point, and I was shocked at this. I hadn't expected that the tipping point would be when prenuptial sex is permitted. But when it is, a tipping point is crossed, and then three predictions come true, according to his research. Number one, rational thought disappears within 2 generations, that people no longer use rationality and logic to arrive at their conclusions, but more tend to go towards what they want to believe instead. That happens. Number 2 is strict monogamy disappears. And he defines strict monogamy as the marriage, lifelong relationship between one man and one woman. That then disintegrates down into modified monogamy, which is a series of relationships, either common law or marriage. In our culture, we would use those terms, which then degenerate down into even just general polyamory. The third thing that happens is that belief in God just sort of wanes, and it just disintegrates, belief in God. Now, when you look at what happened after the sexual revolution in our culture, which began in the 1960s, you see that all three of those predictions have come true in a remarkably obvious way. First of all, belief in God has just plummeted in our civilization. Rational thought today, I would say it's become really obvious in the last, say, decade, has just gone out the window. And now it becomes more important that you don't talk about things that are absolutely true or false, because that's thought to be almost bigoted to be able to talk in those terms. Rather, people speak and believe in terms of what they want to believe or what they identify as. Anything that they want to believe is now sacred. It is more important than what is actually true, and believing that there's actual truth out there is actually not good. You'll pay a price for that.
Now there's such a thing as hate facts, where if you say something that's true, but it hurts someone's feelings, therefore it's hateful and it's verboten. It's not the fact that what you said is 100% accurate and provable has nothing to do with the fact that it hurt this guy's feelings over here and therefore you're in trouble. The reality of the situation is totally irrelevant.
Yeah, the truth actually is a way of modifying our beliefs so that we can flourish within reality. But when a person sets aside truth and decides to go with what they want to believe, eventually they clash with the real world, with reality. And when that happens, that's just part of another aspect of the disintegration of a civilization. So as research showed that when you cross that threshold, when the sexual revolution occurs, every society and civilization will collapse within 3 generations, which he defines as roughly 100 years. Our culture is now in the 2nd generation, and I think our culture is disintegrating faster than the other ones he observed, simply because I think we have more of a global society. We have a way of traveling swiftly between cultures and countries of the world, and we have the internet, which allows ideas just to explode within minutes around the world. And we have pornography, which has accelerated the sexual revolution and destroyed traditional sexual morality at a much faster rate. So when a person says, "Oh, that's irrelevant," it was written in 1934, I'd say, well, wait a sec. You got to test the theory. He provided 3 predictions, and those 3 predictions are occurring within as we speak with amazing clarity. They're totally obvious. And so when we see the predictions come true, we then have to go back to the theory and say, oh, okay, everything is pointing to the collapse of our civilization by the end of this century.
So here's the question for you then. Give me some hope. Is there any way to reverse this process, in your opinion? And if so, what is that hope? Is our civilization doomed to go the way of the Romans and we just have a bumpy ride ahead of us? Or is there any road back from where we currently are?
Oh, that's a golden question, Ben. That is probably the most important question of all. Okay, I'll tell you what Unwin said, and it's not good. He said this process was irreversible in every case. Once you cross that tipping point, it was irreversible. Now, I as a Christian would say, well, but wait a sec here. I think it is reversible at least, but it has to occur starting on the individual level, and that has to do with really taking God seriously and allowing God to. Okay, I admit that I'm, in the eyes of many people here, speaking in a religious sense, but God says there's 2 basic commands: love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. If we truly did that, if we truly did those 2 things, he said all the other moral rules and everything else are summed up in these 2 things. Well, I think that process would be reversible. I mean, when you think of loving God, I know that I hear it all the time. What that means is you're flying planes into in buildings and having religious wars and stuff. No, that's not actually loving God and loving your neighbor. It's not what Jesus taught. But when you actually think of God, he is the origin of every good thing given and every perfect gift, which means he's the origin of music and beauty and love and honor and every good thing. What could possibly be better than loving the one who is the origin of these things? And secondly, what's the harm in loving your neighbor as yourself? So that doesn't mean giving your neighbor everything he wants. Like you said, if you didn't have any protection for a society in a post-apocalyptic scenario, well, the predators would wipe you out. They would. I mean, so there are predators and there are people who function like animals in our society, and that has to be controlled. Otherwise you lose. But and that's just part of loving your neighbor. You don't necessarily give them everything you want. You do what's best for your neighbor. And if they want, say, to get addicted to heroin, you're going to do everything in your power to help them not go down that road. So bad news. Unwin says it's irreversible. But as a Christian, I'm doing what I can, at least in the lives of individual people, to say, hey, individually, you don't have to go down this road. You can still have a wonderfully fulfilling sexual relationship within marriage. You can still have a family of children that becomes one of the most important things to you the older you grow, in your family gatherings and the incredible relationships you can have within a family. Now, a big family doesn't mean you're going to have incredible relationships. Of course not. If a person is not loving their children as, say, Jesus loved us. But it is, I think, no matter how fast that ship is going down, we need to be doing everything in our power to try and slow the sinking, or at least do what we can to try and reverse that as much as we can.
I think you're right that when it comes down to the individual level, that is, I mean, it's all we can do really at the end of the day. Whether it's enough or not is another question. But I as a religious person myself, I'm going to use a religious analogy. I know many people aren't religious and this won't resonate with them, but try to if they could try to strip that away from it and just look at it on its merits, I think a lot of people will get a lot out of this. That I remember hearing, I think it was Saint Jose Maria, saying that the way to become a saint is by doing the small duty of the moment, whatever is right in front of you now. And that when we think about big societal issues like this, we can sometimes tear our hair out thinking about how can we save the world, how can I fix all the ills of society, when the reality is, if we all just decided, you know what, I'm going to start living a certain way, I'm going to take care of my family, I'm going to do right by my community and my job and the things that are in front of me, that would be half the battle or more finished. You know, that society is just a collection of individuals at the end of the day, and we can't do anything more than we can do, but that's a big part of it. But no, I couldn't agree more, and this was really fascinating, and thank you so much for your time, Kirk.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I really enjoyed visiting with you, Ben.
Fantastic. Talk soon. God bless.
Thank you, and you too.